Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart. As I continue to work through painting videos around the release of Grand Cathay, it's time for the Shugengan Lord.
Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Counter-Attack Bases. They stock a wide range of counters, gaming aids and movement trays for multiple game systems and offer custom items to suit your club or even your podcast or YouTube channel. Check out the link in the video description.
Now I think this is an absolutely stunning miniature, especially the Longma. Really beautiful mod on. I'm a big fan of the studio paint scheme. I love all of those oranges and greens and that subtle white in there as well. And I'm going to try and follow that to a certain extent, at least be inspired by it. I might go a little bit different with the Shugengan Lord itself. And as I usually do, I've primed the miniature black, pretty much fully built as well. The rider is removable in this instance, which is really good. None of those cases where the legs are attached to the body, which really helps. I don't like doing lots of sub-assemblies. So they are there, ready to go. And I'm starting with Zenithal Prime with my airbrush, as I so often do. And it's really important that I get a very good quality underpaint on this miniature. Rider, fair. But when I get to the Longma itself, it's really important I have a nice smooth transition from those darker shades through to a very smooth white, because much of the white will be used in the paint job. I'm not just underpainting here. This is also in many cases the base layer, and when I add the thinner glazes of all these oranges and blues, and I'm going to put some yellows and things in as well, I want a nice base to work from, because it's going to do all of the heavy lifting under those glazes. So I want to get these shades right, I want to get these transitions right. So I'm taking my time making sure that white paint is nice and smooth on my airbrush. I'm placing the light where I want it to be. I'm boosting those underpaints and those highlights with dry brushing as well, using all of the modern kits. So your dry palette, I've got a dampening sponge from Knott's Hobbies along with a Knott's Hobbies dry palette here. I've got my white paint on there, and I'm being very careful not to get a streaky dry brushing, so that slightly damp brush, and using circular motions where I can, or working with the detail on the miniature, really enhancing those edges, which will help me when I do a lot of my base layer painting with contrast style paints and glazing and things. Again, the rider is not as important as getting it right here on the Longma. Again, I spoke about it already. I want nice smooth white on there, so the last thing I want to do now is make it horrible and ugly and chalky. So I'm really taking my time making sure that I'm boosting where the light would catch on the miniature on some of those larger flatter surfaces, like on the wings. It's very dangerous here to get some horrible streaks and things going on, so lots of circular motions, keeping that bristles on that brush slightly damp and trying to get a good quality dry brush on there, because it will do so much and make the rest of the painting on this miniature so much easier. And this is what we're left with, and I hope it shows up on the camera. I know it's very hard with white because it just gets bleached out. You can see the black. I've left it completely black underneath the capes. I want them to be black underneath. But the main area was this Longma here, and I hope you can see a nice grey to white transition where I've boosted some of that detail, but it's a pretty smooth Zenithal underpaint on this whole miniature. So I'm starting with those contrast colours in its Griffhound Orange and Magdrodroth Flame, and I'm using the airbrush to put those base layers down. Very thin at the moment, subtle layers. I'm starting underneath the wings because I can control the overspray by the angle that I'm painting at the moment, and that's something else that's important, because there's so many areas that I want to stay white on this miniature, and I don't want to mask all over the place, and I'll show you a couple of other tips that I do in a moment to get around that. But I'm working with the shadow that's already underneath those wings and just adding some thin layers for now. And the whole idea is I can build them up subtly, and if I go too heavy too quickly, not only is it going to make the miniature too wet and it run, I'm also going to mess up some of the underpainting. So just being subtle now, working gently, putting a few base layers in and slowly building it up. And some areas that I want to catch, like the top of the antlers or the bottom of the feet, I can just use a little bit of paper to control my overspray rather than having to mask everywhere. It's so much easier to build up some base transitions with the airbrush than it is with a hairy brush here. So I'm just adding a little bit of colour to the bottom of the feet, the bottom of the antlers. Now Imperial Fist and Iandan Yellow, so we're lighting those colours, and again, the same thing again, building up from those veins more to start with where it's a little bit darker, and then blending out into the wings, and you end up with this kind of nice orangey yellow mix with the highlights in the middle. And that's all being enhanced by the fact that there's a really thin layers with the airbrush, so all that underpainting is showing through and really, really boosting it. Continuing to work my way up through those colours to the brighter yellow here, and just keeping that PSI low, small bursts with the airbrush, so I've got good control. I'm able to add some yellow to the antlers without completely covering the rest of the body, and we're going into the middle of those wings as well, adding that yellow in and just slowly building it all up, and it's starting to look like I wanted it to, or had in my mind, so all good so far. Now with the airbrushing stages over, I've got the hairy brush out, but I'm using those same 4 colours, the 2 orange and the 2 yellow. I've got them on the wet palette. I've added a bit of water to them, but I tend to mix as I go here, and very often I return to the miniature with a little bit of water on the bristles of the brush to actually wet blend and feather out on the miniature, and I'm constantly doing that here, readjusting, making sure what I'm doing is right. And what I'm trying to do is get a connection here organically between the brighter orange wings and the whiter parts of the miniature. So I'm reinforcing the shadows by being a little bit thicker around the veins on those wings, but as they reach the fingers of the arms, not really fingers, I'm allowing them to be a little bit thinner, the paint there, and wet blending it out so that there's a nice kind of organic transition between the white and the orangey yellow parts on those wings. But this continues with all the colours, so I'm glazing here to blend it out. So after I've added some orange, I want to smooth it out. I've thinned the yellow down, and I'm glazing over the whole wing there, keeping it smooth, making sure there's no tide marks. And you really start to build up these really subtle transitions between what you've done with the airbrush, but also smoothing it out, adding a little bit more depth into the shadows, and then just sort of blending it out into the rest of the wing. And I think it's still coming along quite nicely. You can see a little bit closer here more examples of me using very, very thin contrast paint to feather and blend in the yellows and the oranges into the whiter parts of the miniature, so they look like they organically blend from one into the other. And that includes on the antlers at the top as well. They're not antlers, I know that, I just keep calling them that because they look like antlers. It's the best way of describing them, so no need to comment on that one. This is Croxagore scales. Again, this is on my wet palette and quite thin to start with, and I'm moving over to all that green colour that you can see on the studio paint job. I absolutely love the way it looks darker in all the recesses of all those scales, but lighter towards the top. So I've gone thin to start with here so that it runs into those recesses nicely, and I've got that same control that I had with the oranges and the yellows. I can blend it out and feather it out into the white areas just by constantly readjusting here. So I'm taking my time, making sure it doesn't run anywhere that I don't want it to, and if I can see it running, go back with a clean brush straight away and try to control it. But the paint's doing the job for you, or the detail and the paint are doing the job for you a lot of here. And I'm just slowly building up the intensity by going back for a second layer and increasing what's in the shadows there, and if it's too thick, wiping it away from the flatter surface areas of the miniature. And you can see by this stage, as I'm really starting to reinforce the darker areas, the shadows or the top areas of some scale pattern, so that it blends nicely from quite intense green to a much lighter green, blending into the white part on the tail here. And that's a good example of how I'm trying to build up these colours, but keep the textures there as well, and making sure that I'm not going too dark on it. Now for some contrast apothecary white, and I'm doing the same thing. It's on my wet palette, it's thin, probably 50-50 here, and I'm blending it in, starting in the areas that are supposed to be white, or I've chosen them to be white, that loosely match the colour scheme, or at least the colour placement and choices of the studio paint job. I'm blending them out then into those blue areas and into those orange areas. I've made sure those areas are dry, otherwise we could end up with an awful mess. You can wet blend a lot with contrast paints, and I do it a lot as well, but I was happy with my fades out, and I didn't want to catch a little bit of paint that ends up running and making a real mess here, so I have waited for them to dry. So I'm just shading the white areas a little bit more, wiping away from those top surfaces, and that's essentially what apothecary white does here. It's a kind of a grey glaze really, so it just fills in all those shadows and smooths it out. I'm doing a little bit of overlap between the different coloured areas because it does help tie them in together, but just trying to be really careful with this sort of first layer here with the apothecary white to make sure that I don't dirty up the area too much. I don't want to cover all the white that we've laid down with that airbrush so carefully. Now this is it all dry at that first kind of colour layer, and what I want to do here is avoid having to do loads of edge highlighting when you're painting things like scales or hair or feathers. It can take forever, and I want something really striking here as a general for my army, but it's a wargaming army for the tabletop, and this is army painting level stuff here. So I'm going to be doing some more dry brushing, and I'm being even more careful than I was the first time around, using all of that same kit. If you like the Knots Hobby stuff, check out the link in the video description. You get 10% off if you do it that way, but there's lots of places you can pick up dry brushing kit like this. And in fact, these brushes are just from Amazon as well, so you can get them very, very cheap, and also get the really nice high-end Artist Opus stuff, which are great at the same time. So you can find this kit to match your own budget. Maybe the cheaper brushes don't last quite as long, but you can definitely get very good results with them as well. But back to what I'm doing, it's very, very carefully here, just trying to catch some of the edges of the detail. There's so little paint on my brush that it almost doesn't look like it's going on to start with. And I'm trying to do a cheat version of edge highlighting here, so I'm just catching the edges of all those scales and some of the higher details all over the body here of the Longma. And with that very subtle dry brush, what I can do now with even thinner paint, the same colours as before, glaze back over the top again. And what that does is it softens any of the dry brushing you've just done when you've caught the edges, but doesn't take away from the transitions that you've already built in with that earlier glazing work. Some of it with the airbrush, and some of it with the hairy brush with the Croxical scales and so on. So going back with those same colours now, slightly thinner, reinforces those darker areas because you're just adding extra layers to it, but just tones down any areas of dry brushing that maybe look a little bit too much like dry brushing. So you're just adding edge detail really to your scales here, and it's so much quicker than individually painting all those scales in, which looks fantastic, but I don't have the patience for, especially when I'm trying to make a video for a channel like this and I just want a gaming miniature for my table. I've got a lot of gaming miniatures to paint. And you can see me now going around with all of the previous colours I've used, the oranges and the yellows, and just toning down any of that little extra dry brush I did just to blend it back in, and it just gives you that extra boost, that extra pop, makes it look like you've taken some time to go around and do loads of sort of fine edge highlighting, and I've just done none of it at all on this Longma, and I'm really happy with the way it's coming out. There's such striking colours, there's so much detail on the miniature, it makes it easier to use techniques like this, but overall I'm pretty happy so far. This is Trooper White from Two Thin Coats, and it's a slightly off white. It's very thin on my wet palette, and this is the one part of real edge highlighting I'm doing on the miniature. I'm just really boosting those white areas. They don't work quite in the same way for just dry brushing and then glazing back over the top. I just want to make them pop and stand out a little bit more. I'm keeping it thin, otherwise it will get quite chalky. It just helps you boost the transition with some of these areas where it did look a little bit dark. So I've got a little plan about how I'm going to tidy them up, and the start of that is to just really enhance those highlights when I wasn't able to get in there correctly with the dry brush, so tidying things up and making it pop. And it's time for a little bit more glazing, and I have cut some things out of the video just because of the time, but adding a little bit of skeleton horde on the claws. I do go back with a little bit of yellow glaze again and just touch up the transitions between the white areas and the blue areas, so you've got this sort of a greenish tinge as you go through, and I think that really helps out as well. I've chosen Flesh Terror's red for the colour of all of the sort of the fabric areas on the Longma, and I will be using it on the rider as well. This is a really rich dark red. It's almost a royal red. You can imagine it as a velvet or something like that, so it's perfect for this kind of job. So I'm just painting in those few areas in this colour. Then it's black metal and heavy metal from the Scale Colour Scale 75 metal and alchemy range, and I'm just colouring in here the few armour panels that are on the Longma. Adding in a little bit of a subtle highlight with that lighter metallic colour, but there's going to be lots of gold trim as well, so you don't need to worry about it an awful lot here. Then dipping into the same paint range again, we have Necro Gold and Elven Gold. Darker colour first, picking out all of that trim before following up with a bit of a highlight. I'm going to be adding some washes and things to this later on, but getting those base layers down now, and the Longma is very close to being finished. Returning to two thin coats, I'm using Sanguine Scarlet and Demon Red as the highlights for the red. If you're new to my channel and haven't seen how much I use these paints before, you can get really great conversions from the Two Thin Coats website or the Transatlantic Games website. They convert very, very well with Citadel paint. So if you're a Citadel paint user, every time I use one of the Two Thin Coats range, you can nearly always find an exact copy, so it's well worth going and checking them out. But essentially I'm doing very traditional layering, highlighting here with those two colours. They work perfectly with the Flesh Tearers red. They work really well with Blood Angels red contrast paint as well. And I'm just focusing on those areas of detail that are higher, leaving the dark shades in the recesses. This is a ready mixed oil wash from Scale Colour as well, Scale 75, and this is grease, and it's a kind of a medium light brown edging into a sepia kind of tone. So it's very, very good for subtle shades on armour and things like that, rather than going for something really black and dark. I thought this would be well looked after armour. I want a little bit of realism in my metallics, and oil paints I think do that very well because they go into the recesses really nicely and they don't tend to stay on the flat surfaces, and you can wipe them away from the flat surfaces. But I won't bang on about oil paints too much here. I do that in a lot of my videos, but if you haven't tried them before, it's definitely worth looking into. I do recommend them. If you can use a standard wash or something, a sepia would be fine here. If you're going to use something like Agrax Earthshade, maybe thin it slightly and just make sure it doesn't pull too much on the surfaces. Now we're over to the Shugengan Lord, and I'm using Skeleton Horde here, and I'm going to whiz through a lot of this quite quick. So there's some repeated colours and some things that you will find I've already covered in some of the other videos in this series. So if you have watched my tutorial for the Sky Lantern, this recipe here for this sort of tan white clothing is the same that I used in that video, and I'll be using it a little bit in the Big Army Paint video as well, especially on areas of the artillery crew, the gun crew and the rocket crew. But I'm giving a very, very thin glaze layer here over the underpainted miniature. I want it to be really smooth and require very, very subtle highlights to save me time, and that's part of the process of doing all of this underpainting and then dry brushing, is to boost those edges. So when I do a nice thin glaze like this, well controlled, you get a really nice transition from light to dark without having to go back and doing loads and loads of extra highlights afterwards. Now for some Iyanden yellow. I want a nice bright yellow undercloak here rather than the top cloak. I want it to really stand out, and this is a perfect colour for it. It's got enough in it that it will go into the recesses and give some real richness, but not so dark and strong as something like Nazdrag yellow, which will be quite dominating. So again, this is a really nice subtle way of using the underpainting on the miniature, using that shadow that's built in there with the airbrushing. So a nice thin even coat, and it looks pretty cool. Returning with that Flesh Tearers red for some of the areas, mostly the slash, but a couple of little areas on the arms on the inside of the greaves as well. And this is Templar White from Vallejo Express Colour, so it's their own version of Apothecary White, but it's got more of a bluer tinge or tone to it. So I'm using it here. I've decided to keep the top cloak white, and maybe not supposed to be white based on their lore. I haven't fully found that yet, that white's not used too much, but I just really wanted a white cloak, and I thought it'd be perfect for this miniature. So I'm just glazing this in, that's softening down some of the transitions with the airbrush and just really going into the shadows. I just didn't want something that was on the grey spectrum. I want something that was on the blue spectrum. Hopefully Citadel will bring out a contrast paint that matches this kind of colour spectrum as well. But I'm just glazing it in, and it's looking pretty good. Some contrast black Legion, again just tiny little areas here, a little bit on the shoes before it gets to the metal parts, and then there's just a little bit of strapping that holds the sort of the front armor on as well, and also a little bit around the gloves. Both the gloves have got some metal armor on, and one hand is actually the claw for the talons for fighting, but I'm just giving it a base color with the black first, and I'll pick out the metallics a little bit later on. And I'm cutting back areas here for brevity. I've painted in some of the red on the trim, and I've touched it up a little bit, and I'm just glazing back in and touching up the white as I go. There's also other little areas on the miniature that I've already picked out. I've used the same metallic colours that I did on the Longma for all of the armour, and then I'm going to move on now to adding in the same golds as well. So gold on the shoulder pads and gold on some of the trim, on the helmet, on the pommel and the hilt of the sword, and so on. Serpentine yellow, sun bleach yellow and twin sun yellow as well, and those are all Two Thin Coats paints. Again, I'm showing you a little bit more detail here just because we haven't coloured yellow on the miniature already. I'm just using those to subtly highlight that Iandan yellow base that we put down, keeping them quite thin. Lighter the colour is, the more chalky it's likely to be in the way it reacts on the miniature. So keeping those colours quite thin, and I can glaze back a little bit with the contrast colour if I want to. There's not actually much of the cloak, yellow cloak, showing as it is, so you don't have to do an awful lot of work here. Just trying to keep it away from the trim and keep it away from the white and things as well. Just going back here with some Vampire Fang actually in a little bit white, so I didn't show this at all, but just touching up where I used the Skeleton Horde on that clothing that I mentioned earlier on. It's fully dry now, so I've worked my way through painting in all of those other base layers, so it's time to come around and just make those legs pop a little bit more by tidying up the highlights. And it's very much a time of touching up and finishing off here. The trim on all of our red needs both of the same reds we used on the Longma to highlight, and that takes a little bit of time, especially with all of that really light detail there, all of that sort of lace work and things. So that was slightly time consuming, a lot of that done off camera. And then going back here and adding that same grease oil wash to all the metallics, which again in some areas I took off and some areas that I just boosted afterwards by going back in with the top silver or the top gold, just to make it pop a little bit more. This is Barbarian Brawn, Dwarven Skin, Elven Skin and Pale Skin, which is of a nice little 4 colours that I use on a lot of my skin recipes. The Pale Skin is actually a bright, the others are part of a triad, and it's very, very simple here. I'm just building up the layering of those skin tones the same as you would do in any normal painter. So starting with the darkest colour, working my way up to the top. Each stage I'm using a little bit less paint, focusing on the bridge of the nose, on the cheekbones. There's no forehead to show here at all. There's very little of the face showing, there's very little skin showing at all on the miniature. And then using some Vulpus pink contrast paint, thinned probably 2 parts water, just to make a really subtle glaze here. I'm just applying it to the bottom third of the face, so underneath the nose, around the lips and around the cheek. It just adds a little bit of warmth there, makes it look a little bit more alive. And at this stage it's very much finishing touches, adding some dry pigments to the bases. I'm not going to go through which ones I've used. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the army painting video. There is a basing tutorial video that I've made recently. I'll try and remember to pop a link in that now. Talks you through some of my principles and some of the equipment I use and some of the tools I use in terms of paints and basing textures and things like that. But I use some very simple techniques that I think make really, really nice looking bases. A few little tufts going on here, that kind of thing. I like to paint the rims of my bases black as well. But that's it. That's the Shugengan Lord on Longma done. Let's have a look at some proper pictures. This is a really interesting miniature to paint. I think it's a stunning miniature, especially the Longma. I love it, but the posing is quite challenging to paint in some ways, and also to photograph. Certain angles you just don't get to see the miniatures much nicer in hand, and you can see lots of different angles. A lot of miniatures have that golden angle, but sometimes it's hard to get that, and I felt that while painting a little bit as well. But it was a lot easier to paint than I thought it might be. I'm happy I went down the route of the heavy prep with the zenithal and the smooth dry brushing, and used all those glazed layers. If I painted more traditionally, starting from dark and moving my way up to the higher colours, I think it would have taken me absolutely ages. I'm sure this will be the subject of many a competition paint job, and the real top-end painters will do an absolutely stunning job with this. This, as I've said numerous times, that it is very much for my army, so I want it to be eye-catching and people think, wow, that's really cool. But obviously when they look at it closely, they can see that I've cut corners and things. So I'm happy with that. I'm accepting that. But I think it looks pretty cool. It's come out quite well, and let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed it, please comment below, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, all of that usual stuff. There's more Cathay on the way. The next video is the big army paint video that brings all of the stuff together. You see the individual tutorials of some of the bigger stuff. Well, in the army paint video, I talked through my sort of thought process about assembling the army and working on the units and how I approached it. They're very, very detailed miniatures, and I needed to approach it in a way that I could get it done in a reasonable amount of time, which I think is the way a lot of us think when it comes to army painting. So that will definitely be covered in that video, along with lots of cool shots of the whole army lined up and some of my future plans for it as well. So make sure you're subscribed for that. And if you're still here and you'd really like to support me, please do check out my Patreon. It really is the best way that you can make sure that I'm able to keep making videos like this. The financial support really helps pay for the time it takes to film and edit and put these videos together. I will continue to do them because I love making them, but to keep doing them at a regular pace and then pumping them out 1 or 2 or 3 sometimes a week, then Patreon really is the way you can support me in doing that, and I really appreciate it. But you can also support me in other ways, like joining the Discord, which is completely free. You can follow me on social media. I'm on all of the major platforms on there, and check out my channel sponsors, Counterattack Bases, and the other affiliate links that you can find in the video description. But thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.